All right, we're going to go ahead and kick it off. It looks like people are still trickling in. We don't have an update today. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to put together the cloud native update, so I hope y'all will forgive me. But yeah, just going to do a quick introduction of what the call is for anyone that's joining for the first time. And luckily today we do have Michael from the AKS product group on the call, so he'll be doing all of the AKS updates anyways. So I think that that will be good to go on that front. So my name is Kendall Roden. If we haven't had the chance to work together, or if you've never joined the call before, my teammate Dave and I run these AKS office hours. So, just a little bit about us. I'm a co-host on the Azure podcast. I would love to connect after the calls. I know we've connected before, so it's great to see all of you again. And then Dave wasn't able to make it today; he's out of office. But if you want to connect with him, he's also on Twitter. So why do we create the AKS office hours? So really the goal here is just to provide people using AKS outside of Microsoft with updates pertaining to AKS, new features, roadmap, and then also just generally to talk about the cloud native ecosystem. So obviously there's a lot of really cool open source projects, and thanks Richard just dropped something in, some cool open source stuff. So yeah, if you have any updates or any exciting things that you'd like to share, feel free to drop those in the chat window, because there's definitely always something going on in the open source space, even if it's only been 2 weeks since we've met. So as I mentioned, every couple of months we bring in some PMs from the PG to talk from the product group. Sorry, that was a lot of acronyms, to talk about the product backlog and just things that we're working on, what you can expect. So this is a good time to ask questions around things like when will this be released or what can we expect, because they're going to have a much better understanding of the timeline, the roadmap, and what's publicly shareable. So just keep that in mind. If you join next week and ask those questions and they're not here, it's a lot harder for us to answer those for you. And then obviously this is always a good time to give feedback while we have them on the call. So if you're running into issues or have blockers or just questions or suggestions, now is a good time to surface some of those. So before I pass it over to Michael, I do want to say at the end of the updates, which usually doesn't take the whole time, but feel free to ask questions as we go. We definitely want you to get the most out of this session. And we want to make sure that it's as valuable as possible for Michael as well. And then at the end of the call, there is a couple of questions that I have for y'all related to one of the features that they're working on. I'm not sure if Quentin was able to join or not. Let's take a look. Yeah, so I don't see him on the call, but there is some feedback that they're looking for around some of their auto upgrade features and some of the ways that they're going to architect that or build that out based on some of the feedback. So if you're interested in sticking around at the end of the updates, which should still be within the call time, then we can have a discussion around that. And I will ask at this point, can everybody just please make sure you're on mute if you're not speaking or asking a question, just so we can get the highest quality of audio. All right, Michael, are you good to take over at this point? Perfect. Perfect. And I will say, I know I didn't call this out because we have talked about this a good bit before, but KubeCon is coming up, so definitely take a look. They release the schedule, and make sure you're building out that schedule and what you're interested in hearing about. And then we'll definitely do some debriefs on the call after KubeCon wraps up and have a discussion around learnings and insights that we all took away.
Great. Thank you, Kendall, and everybody can hear me properly, right? And see my screen.
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you, and yes, it's being recorded.
Great. All right, so thanks everybody for attending the office hours. So as Kendall said, my name is Michael Withrow. I'm a senior product manager for AKS. To start out, obviously, I think if you haven't been on the call before, we do publicly share our roadmap. You can see our link here. So just grab that, and you can basically check in this. We're constantly updating this as we're rolling through our feature set. We break this down per semester. So if you basically see something that's in development or planned, just know that it's coming within that current semester is the model that we're kind of working through. So to kind of start out from a theme perspective, I just want to make sure that everybody understands there's really 3 big themes that we're kind of driving for this particular semester. One, as we've kind of been looking at the metrics, we've kind of noticed that while there's a lot of people deploying Kubernetes clusters, there's not a ton of people deploying applications onto those clusters. So one of the things that we're working on is trying to make the developer experience more integrated. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we're kind of going through. Secondly, we understand from a security perspective, there's quite a few gaps there. So security is a big thing that we're obviously working on and closing those particular gaps. And then thirdly, at talking to customers as well, we've heard a lot of feedback around operations, day two based operations capabilities. So we're bringing a lot of features that are going to try to make those day two capabilities a lot simpler. All right. So with that, I'll kind of start out at the generally available. So to start out, we've now GA'd the kubelet user assigned managed identity. With that, we are strongly urging customers to basically move their clusters from service principal over to managed identity. I'm actually going to be starting the deprecation process for service principal now, which will kind of start the timeline for that 3-year deprecation process. Obviously, there's obviously a lot more management overhead, or say operational overhead, with those service principals managing the credentials, the expiration of those credentials. We get a lot of ICMs and support issues around service principals. So we've basically GA'd the entire feature set for managed identity, and actually have a tool for you to take an in-place cluster that is based off of service principal and migrate everything over to managed identity. So for your clusters or clusters that you're managing for customers, please work to get those converted over to managed identity. Currently, as we look across the cluster construct, about 46% of the overall clusters are running managed identity. I'm working really hard to try to drive that up to well over 85% by the end of the calendar year. So from a capabilities point of view, we have now GA'd Kubernetes 1.21, and with that, we have also GA'd finally the CSI storage drivers. So if you're working with customers that are looking to deploy persistent-based applications on AKS, we've now GA'd that feature set. So you can look at that. If you have any questions, please fire away on that front. As well as that, I kind of talked about the developer experience. We have been working with the ASC team to bring in first and foremost shift left capabilities. And what does that really mean? By integrating ADO and GitHub Actions with Azure Security Center, there is now a static analysis capability that as you're building images, it'll show the output of that build within your tool, and it will also publish that information inside of Azure Security Center. So that is now GA'd. That is really just GA'ing the audit capability. There's quite a few roadmap items around restriction and enforcement, blocking builds that exceed a threshold as an example, which will be complemented by policy. That's something we're working on this particular semester, bringing in Windows static analysis, compliance, those kind of things like that. But for the most part, that set is now GA'd. It's just enhancing that capability. You can subscribe to that by enabling Azure Security Center on your AKS cluster and then enabling the ACR SKU. That will bring in the supply chain capability. Obviously, there's still some gaps there, which I'll talk about as we move down the line as well. Any questions so far? All right. So now
there is a question. Sorry, Michael. So I think based on Richard's comment, so Trivy is the open source tool. Are y'all using Trivy in the pipeline to do that? Or to
great
do the
question.
analysis?
Yeah. So under the covers, it is using Trivy right now. We have a couple of action items, work items, I should say, with the Qualys partnership on the back end to deliver a couple of capabilities, so we can replace Trivy with Qualys. We don't have a great ETA for that, but it is earmarked for this particular semester. I'm hoping to accelerate that particular timeline, but that is the end game that we're shooting for. All right. If any other questions, Kendall, let me know. Let me pull my chat over to another window. No, never mind. It's fighting me. All right. But yeah, if there's any other questions, Kendall, just let me know and I'll jump into that one. All right. So as we look at public preview, quite a few things that are in flight and are imminent to be moved into GA very, very soon. So from a SKU perspective, if anybody's not aware, we obviously have the Ubuntu hardened OS node, the Windows node. And if you're looking for, especially our financial FSI-based customers, they were looking for a lot of FIPS-based capabilities. So we now have a FIPS-enabled SKU, which is kind of a third SKU that you can leverage as far as an elevated level of hardening. We are working through the GA of that. I think we're looking at later part of Q3 for that GA. If you look at the next feature set, emitting AKS events through Azure Event Grid, when I get into those day 2 operations I was kind of talking about before, one thing that we're working very hard on is basically trying to publish proactive service information in multiple different fronts. So we have Azure Advisor, Azure Health, Azure Security Center, which is publishing information. Also through Event Grid is what we're working through. So depending on where you're at in the business, what your role is within the business, what kind of information you're looking for, we're working to distribute that information through many different conduits as possible, whether it's an API outage, whether it's a security issue, a CVE, a API attack, a update that's required, new features, new policies that you can leverage to enhance your security posture. Really just if there's an issue with your VMMS scale set, you need to upgrade those nodes. All of those things we are now publishing through Azure Advisor, Azure Health, and then also through Event Grid integration. So multiple caveats or multiple avenues for you to get proactive base information about your clusters. On top of that, as everybody's probably aware, from the onslaught at the beginning, we really, AKS was really designed to be essentially not really designed for multi-tenancy. So the general model was that if you want to deploy and have multiple business units, you deploy a cluster per business unit. There were some foundational reasons why that was the model. We are actually working through and closing those gaps so you can bring a multi-tenanted based model or a platform-based model into your AKS environment. The key around that, the foundational piece around that is around the tagging. So we have essentially some basic tagging we released through the Cloud Tree, which basically gives network-based tagging. So if I've got a load balancer or a front-end ELB as an example, and I'm tagging a resource on the cluster creation, it'll propagate down to the tag. The last piece of work we're doing is making sure that the actual backend RP will be able to propagate the tag. So think of it from a namespace perspective. I want to do segmentation at a namespace, and in that namespace, I deploy a pod with a front-end load balancer, with maybe a firewall on the front end. It's got backend SQL database. So that entire construct will be able to propagate that tag down, which will lead over to the other piece, which is really important, is the billing side of that. So then we're working on the cost management side to bring kube cost-like capabilities to cost management, which will allow you to do segmented costing down at the namespace level. So those would be the two pieces that we're bringing in, which will allow you to do true multi-tenancy capabilities. Obviously, there's other things on the scale side as well, which will be important, which I'm going to talk about here in a couple of minutes as well. Bringing in Containerd. So we're working on feature parity. So for anybody that's probably aware, we have traditionally been working on a model where we build it for Linux and then build it for Windows when the demand is there. We've hit a saturation point where on the demand, where now we're building features out of the box that work unilaterally on Windows and Linux. So going forward, it won't be, does this work on Windows as an example? It just will, because we won't GA it unless it also works on Windows. So you'll start to see, as you look across these feature sets, you'll see a lot of, hey, bringing feature parity in, but you'll see like pod identity when I get over to that one, it just works out of the box with Windows and Linux. Sorry about that. On the identity side, we are now probably here in the next couple of weeks. We're actually going to be announcing this at KubeCon, so if you're there, welcome to one of the first announcements. We will be GAing the removing of the local accounts. What this really does is this basically completes the authentication and authorization story when you look at a secure by default configuration which if you start to see from a theme, I talked about security as one of the themes. I'm starting to bring in a secure by default theme to the AKS configuration, which foundationally starts with the authentication and the authorization story. So obviously, when you look at that secure by default configuration, that means AAD enabling that cluster, which gives you all the AAD support. You can do conditional access, JIT access, so you don't have to just bake admin into the cluster. You give them JIT access into not only the cluster, down to a specific resource within a specific namespace. The caveat with all of that is before, even with an AAD enablement, we didn't disable a local account. So even though you did all your RBAC and your restriction down to the local resource level, there was nothing to stop someone with doing an AZ AKS get credentials -- admin and bypassing that credential set that you set up for them. So now with that AAD enablement, you would do -- disable local, which would basically set up AAD, block the local configurations, then you bring in your authorization mechanism to now lay in role-based access control across the configuration. So that's all there. That's the foundational piece when you look at that secure by default construct. Obviously bringing in the private cluster, all the private cluster work that we've been doing as well. I'll kind of talk through that in a minute. That'll be like the next side of that is bringing in the network side of the conversation. For most of the people on the call, they've probably dealt with private clusters, understanding the complexity, the nuances with that. So we're constantly working to enhance the DNS, whether that's private DNS or public DNS, as far as your networking, how that works, the administration of that cluster with the run command. So now you have a AZ native call, even if you're not on the network, to be able to get in the cluster and administer the cluster. Obviously, we understand that this is a very powerful capability. This comes with a very specified role. So you want to do your role-based access control for that particular role, and then JIT enable or conditional access enable that role configuration to see who can run, that run command, because obviously it gives you, cross network based access. So it's a very powerful capability, but obviously you need to think about the implications of that power.
Michael, before we continue, before we continue,
we
do have some questions. So Ted, are you able to come off mute and ask a question? It seems like your hand is up.
Yeah, I can.
Perfect.
So I had a question about the local account. So
sure,
I had a look at that, and to do so if you want to do a -- admin, you need to be at least contributor. But if you are a contributor, you can also modify the cluster with that local account feature, because you can do that on the runtime. So I was wondering if there would be some extra role that would allow you to only do that with a specific admin role, because currently, as I said, if you are a contributor, you can also modify that part of the cluster to be able to bypass that. So, which you also need to do the -- admin anyway. So I was kind of wondering what the security difference is.
So it depends on what action you're actually doing, right? So you should be able to segment down with the authorization where you don't need contributor rights to do X, Y, and Z action. So obviously it comes down to what action you're doing. So maybe as a follow-up, Kendall, can you put me in touch with him, and we can email, and then I can walk you through how to secure that config.
Yeah. So the point I was trying to make is that to be able to do the -- admin, you would need to be a contributor. But if you're not a contributor, then you can't do the -- admin, and you don't necessarily have to not have that feature. Well, maybe it's a bit confusing, so maybe we should talk afterwards.
Yeah, so let's do an email on it, and then there might be some guidance that I can add to the documentation to make that very, very clear. So I hear your point, but I want to make sure we're crystal clear on the ask there. So let's circle back offline, and I can maybe provide some enhancements to the document around that.
Thank you.
Okay, great. And then
did we lose you, Kendall?
It looked like it.
So was there a second question? If you want to come off mute and just ask the question, that's fine.
Yeah, there was a couple in the chat window. Sorry, my headset died, so I'm just going to read these off real quickly. So one is that going to delay GA for traditional Linux node capabilities requiring the Windows support? Like, is requiring the Windows support delayed? Okay.
It will not, no.
Okay. Will Azure Lighthouse work with clusters with no local account? Had issues with Lighthouse and AKS roles in the past.
I'd like to talk about that a little bit more as well to make sure I understand that, so I can work through that as well. So maybe a direct email on that request as well would help.
No worries. Sounds good. And then can you talk about containers using GPUs? Seems like you can only run one container per GPU, and that becomes an expensive solution. Is that pertaining to an update, or is that just did you talk about GPUs at all, Michael?
Not yet, but I can't hit that data point. So yeah, so obviously GPU, we understand that it's expensive. We're working with the GPU team to see if there's something we can do there. Obviously, that is relegated. We're thinking from a usage perspective, it's relegated to highly specialized, intensive-based workloads, but it's due to the back-end hardware on the back end. Yeah, so I'd say really no probably better answer on that at the current time.
Okay. Another one is the private cluster docs need updating, still shows the wrong commands when you're creating them. You know what, Richard? I feel like you know that you can. I would just go in and create an issue on that actual doc at the bottom. Like I would just throw that in there. It's probably the easiest channel for that. And then AKS run command still has a serious limitation. It truncates the data. For example, equivalent of kubectl get pods. Is this being fixed?
Yes, it is, and that's one of the things we were working on before we GA'd it. Yep.
Okay, awesome. And then let's see if any new ones came up. Yep. Azure Arc has a proxy function to allow remote people to kubectl into private clusters. Is that feature GA, or will it GA soon? And if so, when?
Let me sync with the Arc team to see. I'm familiar with that feature set, but I don't know the timeline, to be honest.
Okay. Okay, no worries. Is there any plan to remove the Docker bridge cider with the container need GA?
Yes.
Cool. And then last one that we have from Ted, can AKS run command now to do an interactive exec or port forward?
Another feature that we're adding to the run command before we went to GA. Yes.
Okay, awesome. That clears them all up. And if for the ones that I'll follow up on, I'll get their emails in and we can circle back on those.
Yep, perfect. Okay. All right, so driving on, let's see. So I talked about local accounts, bringing in password reset capabilities on the nodes. That's going to GA pretty soon. For secrets management, we are planning to GA this in October. The upstream will GA in September, and then we on the AKS side for the managed component will GA that in October. So if you're looking for secrets management, that will be GA'd very, very soon. Open service mesh, we are planning to GA that at KubeCon, another announcement that will be coming out there as well. There's additional scenarios we're kind of looking at for next gen. Think of like the AKS HADR capabilities, blue-green scenarios. These are all things in the roadmap for open service mesh that'll be coming post KubeCon as an example. So a lot of great capabilities coming in there to kind of leapfrog, I shouldn't say the competitors, but to really make OSM very, very compelling. When we look at the CNIV next, allowing the creation of node pools in different subnets, we're working through the GA of that. Once again, I think that's another thing we're targeting at KubeCon. But obviously, think of that as you know, no longer pre-reserving the IP addresses, consuming IP address space, allowing you to dynamically scale subnets as one subnet's available, segmenting out the system pool pods from the application pods from a subnet perspective, are all some of the key capabilities that you get with this CNI Next capability. Automatic node upgrade for node versions, working through the GA of that. I know there was some questions. Quentin was looking for some feedback on the automatic upgrades. That's one of the things we can kind of talk through, but we're working through the GA of that. Out of tree, there's a lot of capabilities coming in. Obviously, we are working a lot of different capabilities on the storage front. We are, from a upstream perspective, we are making a rapid amount of enhancements and checking in features at a rapid clip. one of the things that we found is that with the release cadence of Kubernetes, as an example, we would do a fix on the cloud provider, but essentially then we would have to wait for it to be in the next version. So it would be a 3 or 4 month lag before a customer can consume that. So we just decided to bring in the Outer Tree cloud provider so you could leverage that feature set right there through the provider instead of waiting, and then bring that into your current version of Kubernetes instead of waiting for the next gen, so to speak, in order to do that. So that's kind of really allows you to accelerate from a timeline perspective, any leveraging the latest and greatest from a storage configuration. Same thing, Ultra SSD. So depending on your workload, this is a really, really expensive feature as well, but it is there for those highly specialized, highly intensive based workloads. So if you need it, it is there. We are working through the final steps of GAing it, and it really comes down to the availability of it. That's one of the last things we're working through, and this will just move over to GA. I talked about Azure Resource Health, another mechanism for us pushing everything out. I talked about all the private cluster enhancements. So we're working on public DNS as an example. I have that there. So if you're aware, we, from a capabilities point of view, we have a concept of when you basically specify your private cluster, you would specify -- enable private cluster, enable private DNS, whether you do custom or none or system. From a configuration perspective, that is essentially deploying a private DNS zone. Well, as most people are probably aware, if you've played with that, there's limitations as far as how you set up those private DNS zones, how you do subzones, or the lack of subzones therein. So if you're basically trying to do a landing zone type of model, and you're basically plugging in multiple AKS clusters or clusters in general into that landing zone, you're inherently going to have collisions from the namespace perspective, or I'd say the zone perspective, based off of the lack of subzone-based support. So it's pretty complex to set up. There's limitations there. Obviously, there's configuration that's required to go through and set up your conditional forwarder, to set up your peering in order for you to have your routing set up. So in order to simplify all of that, we've just released public DNS as well. We should be GAing that the first week of September. And that obviously greatly simplifies your networking, your routing capabilities. The key that you think about is, obviously, I've talked to many customers about this, say, well, we have a corporate mandate, we can't use public DNS. Okay, right, I get that. That's one thing you have to work through. That makes sense. The key that we're doing is this opens up the multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, simplifies the routing for your cluster. It's another alternative you can use if your organization will allow you to use it. When you work through those security conversations, the key thing that you want to work through when you're talking within your organization is that, yes, it is a public DNS zone, and we're basically integrating the API server address with that zone. But the backend cluster, that address space, if they were even to figure it out, it is still not even routable, right? So the risk is minimal, right? Other than the fact that it is exposing your API server private address into that public DNS zone. But just something to think about if you want to bring that into your organization. I talked about the CNI support. There's a lot of work going on from a CIS perspective. Google has a very good document around what CIS looks like, for Google. I'm working on mirroring that configuration, bringing the same construct there, and actually taking it to the next level. Not only the Kubernetes CIS construct, but the Ubuntu CIS construct and the Windows CIS construct will all be layered there as well. The reason I bring that up here is because obviously there's going to be certain settings which we, from a CIS perspective, own from a platform managed service perspective, but there will be certain settings you as a customer can configure, right? So we kind of expose those out, allow you to make certain customizations, not only from a CIS perspective, but also from a functionality perspective, operations perspective. You can do some level of customization that will be persistent through a node image upgrade, as an example. That will be GA'd very, very soon. There's a lot of conversations going on around pod identity. We have just started the private preview for pod identity v2, which is now going to be known as Azure AD Workload Identity. That's the new name for it. We just finalized the marketing on that. Like I said, it is in a private preview now. We have a host of customers leveraging that. That is OIDC discovery-based identity, I should say. The great news with this capability is that as you look at Pod Identity v1, it was very OS-centric and was built for Linux out of the box. And we had a work item, a backlog item to bring it to Windows, which required forking the directory, bringing in HNC support in the compute layer, putting dependencies on the partner teams, delays. It was just really a lot of work. So with OIDC, it simplified that because now it's just language support. So there's a .NET SDK, there's a Go SDK, bridge that into Pod Identity, and it all just works out of the box. We already have customers that have prototyped it on Windows, works like a champ, just like it does on the Linux side. So now it's just a matter of working through the public preview so we can start working towards GA. The hard part about that is that that might not be till next year because we got to bring managed identity to public preview before we can GA it. But the good news is if you have customers that want Pod Identity for Windows, let me know and we can talk to them about the private preview. Get them in so they can start kicking the tires on that. On planned maintenance windows, we're doing a lot of work, like I said, on those day 2. We've had support tickets, a lot of issues around, hey, look, we are managing the nodes on your behalf. They have the canonical updates on the backend nodes. So if there's an update, we'll apply. And there was a big outage that happened a couple of weeks ago because canonical basically had a bug patch, and it basically caused a reboot, an outage for a bunch of AKS nodes. So what we talked to customers about, if you would just subscribe to that planned maintenance windows for that cluster, even though it still would have caused a bug, you would have had it in a prescribed window and it would have minimized the impact to your workloads on top. So strongly encouraged to basically integrate for those production-based clusters, integrate them into planned maintenance window. And then we've now integrated planned maintenance window with auto upgrade and auto upgrade with planned maintenance window. So you can basically schedule when you update them and at what time of the day you update them and what capability you're upgrading, whether you're upgrading the entire cluster, whether you're just upgrading the images to stay on the latest SKU, close the vulnerabilities. You have some choices there as far as what that upgrade scenario looks like, which gets into these 2 items there. Network policy, Calico. So if you're looking for network management for pod level transactions on Windows, now Calico is supporting that. There's a lot of enhancements coming there, but you have network support. I talked about identity support, all the authentication and authorization mechanisms, the JIT capabilities, all that works on Windows. So we're starting to really cut the limitations on the Windows security side to make it easier for enterprise customers to adopt it. Azure Migrate, I talked about the DevOps capabilities. Like I said, we're trying to bring in a lot of capabilities that makes it easier to deploy workloads into AKS. So Azure Migrate is now part of that, and now you can basically take a VM, dump it at Azure Migrate, and it'll spit out a pod on AKS for you. Obviously, that's still infantile in what the capabilities are, but you can see where the vision is, where it's going. So think of right now as only taking 5% of scenarios, but obviously they're going to start taking a bigger bite out of those scenarios till they get to the end state of you can just take any IaaS VM and probably even not even there, take a Google VM, an on-prem VM, basically pass it at Azure Migrate, and it'll spit it out as a pod on AKS. Kendall, are there questions coming? I see I am chatting. I just want to make sure if there's any questions, I can dive into those.
Yeah, both of them have been answered. There was a question a bit ago. Is there a latency at, I think it's etcd is what they're asking. Is there like an etcd latency issue between clusters in different availability zones?
So, okay, let me hit on that one. So I think we have this here in our capability. We don't have it here. Okay, so there's some cool things we're working on as far as scale and availability. So obviously we have uptime SLA that you can subscribe to. So by default, when you deploy a cluster, it's essentially using the free API SKU, which is essentially we're doing our work to make sure it's resilient. But it's not a financially backed SLA, right? So if customers are really worried about availability, whether it's API or etcd, on that front, definitely go to that upstream SLA. There's a little bit of an uptick in price, but it shouldn't be outrageous from a configuration perspective. The reason for the uptick in price is because there's dedicated infrastructure and availability HADR of the master tier to support that SLA. So that's one thing there. Let's see. So hopefully that hit that question. If you were talking about etcd security, just to make sure I hit that data point, we're also working on KMS. We're trying to figure out exactly when we bring that in, but KMS is on the roadmap. KMS is coming. I think if I was to say realistically, we're looking at Q4 for at least for the public preview for that. And we may be able to target GA by the end of the calendar year, but that most likely will slip to early next year for GA.
Okay,
right.
got a couple more questions here. Is there a plan? I know you get this one a lot. Is there a plan for Kata to be a standard add-on build option on it?
Great question. We just had a review meeting on this yesterday. Yes, we are investigating how and what it would look like and what the implications are, right? So looking at how it can enhance cluster autoscaler as an example are things that we're doing. We are just at the very preliminary stages, but it is something we are investigating and how intrusive and how helpful it potentially could be.
And then there's a question around bridge to Kubernetes for private AKS clusters. If you aren't sure on this one, I can reach out to the bridge PM, but I thought I might ask in case you knew.
Yeah, fire away. I can help. What's the question?
No, it's literally bridge to Kubernetes, like for debugging your AKS cluster for private clusters. Like, do you know if there's any work being done on that?
There is. So it's a work item in the queue for them. I think that's earmarked for Q4, but it's something that they're working on.
Yeah, their backlog is public as well, so that's something
that
to
is
keep.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
All right. If there's any other questions, just interrupt me and I'll dive in. Okay. So 20 minutes. Let's see how much headway I can make. Okay. So now, what is also in the queue, right? So there's quite a bit of things that are in there. I talked about pod identity. V2, actually you need to rename this because now it's no longer pod identity. It's Azure AD workload identity. Is essentially the net new name. Mutation for labels and taints. We're working on that. That's something that's bringing in, like I said, mutation capabilities for that on your cluster. Unifying labels, right? So all of that multi-tenancy stuff, configuration stuff, we're doing a lot of enhancements on. For legacy, we are trying to get everybody off of VMAS over to VMMS, VMM scale set, because we're still trying to work on the next gen of VM scale set as well. So we are working on a tool to allow for an in-place upgrade from that cluster from VMAS over to VM scale set. So if you're stuck, have a customer stuck, we're trying to unblock that so they can get over without having to recreate the cluster. I talked about, for everybody's on the call last time, from the security perspective, we are working on end-to-end based security. I already talked about the shift left on the supply chain, static analysis capability, all the way to the right on the application side. So I deploy a workload. How do I know if it's vulnerable? How do I know if it has a crypto attack, a cyber attack? How do I know that? How do I protect it? How do I audit, alert on that mechanism? We are working on the Azure Defender runtime. So there is an existing capability called Azure Defender for Kubernetes, which is an agent which can be installed on the VMMS scale set, which pulls data from log analytics. So that is essentially a traditional based model we have forked away from. So now we are on September 13th, we are announcing a public preview of the new managed add-on, which is you do -- enable Defender on the command line as an example, which will deploy a daemon set, which is a privileged pod that you'll deploy on your cluster, which will, out of the box, will do continual vulnerability scanning of pods on that cluster. So that's going to be a net new capability that it doesn't exist today. So if there's any drift on that running pod through Azure Security Center, through that Defender integration, I can now see that drift and alert on that drift from a vulnerability perspective. On the roadmap for that one is all the runtime stuff I alluded to. So very soon at Ignite in November, we'll be announcing some things around essentially profiling capabilities. So automatic profiling. So as pods are deployed in the cluster, detecting what the inventory is, building a whitelist off of that inventory, and then preventing or detecting drift, whitelist, blacklist scenarios off of that configuration. So these are all future things that we're working on, but that kind of gives you some vision into the end state. And so the idea is when we look at that secure by default configuration, obviously it's AAD integration, RBAC integration, private cluster configuration, making sure Azure policies there. So we do the end-to-end security for enforcement, and Azure Security bolted on to give you the end-to-end build pipeline, secure pipeline capability, cluster-based security, whether it's API attacks, etcd-based attacks, node-level security for your worker nodes, and then obviously the continual scanning, the runtime security for your workloads that are sitting on top of the AKS cluster. So you'll start to hear very soon some new SKUs will be opened up through the Azure Security Center, which you can subscribe to, which will light up these end-to-end security capabilities. The great news about that as well is this will also be fed into Arc. So you can now, not only will this work natively out of the box, so I deploy a cluster, attach ASC, now I've got this end-to-end SKU natively, but I can now, it's also going to be Arc attached. So I've deployed in a multi-cloud on premises, I can deploy these configurations across those stacks as well. Node pool start stop. So we have start stop at the cluster level. This is just bringing it down to the node pool level. So once again, when you look at multi-tenancy, I have a cluster that's a platform, but I have certain business units that just want to stop their stuff over the weekend. You have the ability to do that. HTTP proxies.
Sorry, Michael.
Yeah. No, fire away.
Okay, there's a couple things here on Azure policy. I know we haven't talked much about that, but there was a question around, has there been any headway determining interoperability between tools like Prisma Compute and Azure policy when it comes to OPA? And then there was another question around, like, is custom policies for Azure policy for Kubernetes still planned to GA soon? So those are the two.
Great question. Okay, let me dive into policy a little bit as well, because obviously, so short answer is yes, custom policy is actually going to go to public preview here in the next couple of weeks on AKS. Actually, we're going to announce that, like I said, but in the next couple of weeks before KubeCon as well. We have quite a few customers waiting on that as well. On top of that, there is a ton of work that we are doing from an AKS perspective to fix the built-in policies, adding in exclusion levels, making them work on Windows, fixing the, most of the built-in policies have varying issues with how they apply, false positives, those kind of things like that are all being built out. And with that, there is a net new capability. There's going to be mutation capabilities added to Azure Policy. We're bringing an external data source capability to Azure Policy as well, which will bring in the end-to-end policy construct I was talking about. Is, hey, look, Azure Security Center assessed a build. Now I attach Azure Policy with a threshold to basically validate the state of that content by looking at Qualys as an example, and then restricting that build based off of the state. When I get into the registry, looking at the signature through Notary, which is going public preview in September. That's on my list here, but I figured I would just hit that as well. Now going through and saying, hey, look, that signature is from my trusted source. I'll allow that deployment. Or no, based off of that external source, I could not verify that signature. Therefore, I'm blocking that deployment. Same thing on the vulnerability side. Someone tries to deploy an image to the cluster that has a vulnerability, use that policy to verify that state and restrict based off of a threshold. And same thing on the runtime side. So now it's up and running. I detect a cyber attack. I can use policy to prevent that cyber attack. Does that help? The intention from a capability point of view is that once this stuff is done, you will not need to bolt on a third party. That's where we're going. The
Was
question
there-
is how quick can you get there?
Sorry, it seems like one of the customers had come off mute. Was
Yeah.
there another question?
Yeah, please ask.
Okay. Oh, I see someone off mute. Are you able to talk? Okay, never mind.
Thought I heard him for a second, but yeah, if you
Yeah.
come off mute, go ahead and just ask. I can dive in.
Yeah, there's
I'll come off mute because I originally asked the interop question
okay, thanks.
between third parties. So it sounds like the plan is to replace the need for the third party, so interoperability won't be an issue.
That's correct. Yep. So you will have choice if you want to bolt on third party, leverage the native stuff. The end game is you'll have choice.
Okay, but the recommendation is not going to be defense in depth by enabling both of them.
I mean, you definitely could, but there's a tax that you probably will incur by doing that, right?
Okay. Yeah. I know some overzealous security people that on the policy side that manage the Azure subscriptions that want to control things with Azure policy, and then the container specific managers that want to have their tools and stuff. So I just want to make sure that it's clear that there's no plan to mitigate interoperability. That will be a customer responsibility to understand and mitigate on their own if they want to enable defense in depth.
Yeah, so you would look at it from essentially from a SKU perspective. So I've actually talked to a couple of customers about this as well. They said, hey, look, I've already bought Prisma or StackRox or Aquasec today. I've paid for it. I'm using it. I'm comfortable with it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe for build or for registry scanning, it makes sense just to use ACR. So once again, we'll allow you to light that up, but then maybe you're double paying, and you can work back with Aquasec to say, hey, look, I want to pay for everything but my registry scanning. So like I said, it'll kind of be that conversation back and forth to make sure, one, you're not double paying. If you are, you're comfortable with double paying. There's also the tax of 2 scanners hitting the registry, 2 scanners hitting the build, 2 scanners hitting the runtime, right, affecting the workload. Those are all things to work through. There should be no reason you can't do it, but I would just be very careful in how you kind of step through them.
Yeah, I guess my question would come down to how does Azure policy leverage OPA, and what's the frequency to calculate the outcome of interop between 2 products like Prisma Computer, Aquasec, for instance, and the Azure policy?
Okay, so to kind of hit that directly, so Azure policy is built on OPA on the back end. That's what's under the covers anyway, right? So as OPA capabilities, and that's why I brought up mutation, right? So adding mutation capability to OPA, then that will get released out into Azure policy on that update when we lay the new version of OPA into Azure policy.
Okay, I can probably offline with some more context
and we can
stuff. I don't want
through
to
it
tie this up with that.
No, but I see where you're going with that. But yeah, we can definitely talk through that offline.
Okay, cool.
Awesome. Right. I had just a couple more questions.
Yeah, fire away.
Okay, one around, when will it be possible to enable Azure Defender for container registries for a specific registry instead of at the subscription level? Do you know anything on that?
I don't know exactly, but I can't answer that one. I have to
no worries.
circle back and screw
I have a contact that I'm going to try to bring on to talk about that specifically. So another one is, are we stuck with OPA and Rego, or can we extend the policies to other policy engines? I think right now I said I think it's just OPA and Rego, but
it's open Rego right now. That is correct. Yep.
Okay. I think, and then the custom policies one, is that still happening?
It is. Custom policy is going to go public preview in the next week or so. We're just working through the last bit of support constructs. Everything else is done. We've had very good feedback on the private preview. We've updated the document. We have a Rego document we're waiting to check in. That's already sitting in the queue. It's just making sure that support is enabled and ready to go and comfortable with the turnover, and we will enable custom policy.
Okay, awesome. You're good.
All right. So we got 9 minutes left. So let's step through a couple different things. So Dapper's coming very, very soon. Teleport. I talked about cluster scale down mode. That's another one. GitOps integration. That's that DevSecOps story that I talked about. Bringing in multi-load balancer. This is a big one. So on top of all the platform stuff that we're doing to bring in multi-tenancy, there's obviously known, documented, published scale limits that we are working against, right? So we are doing a bunch of work to fix that, right? So one of the key capabilities is bringing in multi-load balancer support. So as most of you are probably aware, when I deploy an AKS cluster and I attach a load balancer, that gets attached at the cluster level. Well, that load balancer has 600 IPs, 1,000 nodes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which are all that barrier. So now with 121, essentially now we can downgrade that load balancer, now attach the load balancer at the node pool level. So now think of it from a scale perspective. I could just essentially, from a scale perspective, just essentially keep attaching node pools and attaching a load balancer to that node pool, scaling out linearly well past 1,000. And whatever bottlenecks I had before, now the bottlenecks at the load balancer are at the node pool level. So obviously that node pool can only scale to 1,000 as it did before, but there's nothing to stop me from linearly scaling those load balancers. There's going to be inherent complexity with managing those load balancers, but think of it from a routing perspective. I have one node pool that's for public routing, one load balancer with one node pool that's for internal routing, and you could have very complex, refined routing requirements for how you do that. Which now how customers do that is by segmenting clusters, because you obviously have to define your routing at the cluster level.
Can those load balancers share a single IP address range, or do they have to have unique
Great
cuts? Question.
So right now the answer is they cannot, but that is on our roadmap. So we're working on releasing this in phases. Phase 1 is the first cut of that. We're trying to figure out when we're going to release that. But then phase 2 is where we're starting to talk about sharing. Right. So obviously, I want to basically have a single load balancer that's stretched across 3 node pools. As an example, I can share that IP address, correlate that out. Now I've got 3,000 nodes that are running off of a single IP or whatever it might be. So yes, that's on our roadmap.
Nice. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, there were 2 questions in the chat window, and then I probably need like the last 3 minutes of the call.
Yeah, and I could go for another half an hour, but yeah.
Yeah, no, this is great.
So yeah, let's just call it here. If there's any other questions, let me hit some quick data points. So least privilege node access, Notary V2. I can't figure out what Notary V2. That's going public preview next month. Why is that not on my list? I got to find that. Dual stack. We're getting ready to announce some dual stack stuff. I know a lot of people have been asked about dual stack. We have finished the upstream side. So at KubeCon, we're going to announce some cool dual stack stuff that we can bring to AKS as well.
Okay, awesome. Before the time is over, what is the time frame for GitOps to be in public preview, or just maybe timeline around that? Anything there?
KubeCon.
Cool. Clusters scale down mode. Will that mean scale down from ACI first with a deployment that's using both node pools and virtual node pool? Regular node pools and virtual node pools.
Yeah, good question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. Let me work back on that one. So have that for me as a question I can research.
Cool. Yeah, no worries. And then, okay, awesome. So I think that's the questions that we had. I'm going to share my screen just to go through what Quentin had kind of asked about, if that's cool with you, Michael. And then if anybody else has questions, they can drop them in the chat window, and you can go from there. But let me just share my screen really quickly. Okay, let me know if y'all can see.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So basically, auto upgrade as a feature is going GA soon, and the product group and some of the PMs are looking for feedback around a couple specific features that they're toiling with. So one would be basically setting the node image upgrade as the default for all of the upgrade channels. So obviously there are a variety of upgrade channels that you can opt in on, patch, stable, rapid, but basically what they're saying is either way, the node image upgrade is going to be a toggle, but they're thinking about making it default. So like, let's say I'm in the rapid channel or the stable channel, by default, I'm also getting the node images like opted in. So the question is really around the default behavior, not necessarily the feature toggle itself. And the thing to consider, right, is that would imply that your clusters would be disrupted, even if you are in like the stable channel and aren't expecting a lot of updates. Obviously, when a new node image is available, there might be interruption there. So it's just really the default behavior. So what I'm going to do is just drop in the chat window, and I just want you to up whichever one you agree with. Like, yes, this I think sounds good. I'd like the default to be that the node image is on, or that the node image is off. And then the next one is the ability to stop or upgrade or scale down a node pool by force. So the big thing here is obviously when you set things like pod disruption budgets or other potential config on the cluster or on the node pool, I guess, specifically for this, sometimes that will prevent your cluster from actually doing things like a stop or a scale down operation. But like, let's say you just said, like, regardless of what I've applied, I need this node pool to be scaled down. So that's what these two things are about, and they're basically determining if they want to include this in the GA. So my first ask is I'm going to drop them in the chat, but also if you have like a business justification or like a really good, compelling, insight into why you prefer one or the other, please email me directly. I'll drop my email in the chat, but I'm going to just drop the two. I'm going to drop 4 different chats. One is going to be pro for the first one, con for the first one, and then the last 2 are going to be pro and con for the next 2. Okay, so pro toggle for node image by default. So, and then I'm going to put like against. I guess it should be for and against, but I think I spelled against wrong, but that's okay. I think you'll get the gist. So once again, you'll still have the option to toggle, but it's really what the default behavior should be. So if you want to go with pro, the ask would be that you like that in the chat. If you're against, yeah, exactly, Matt. But yeah, if y'all could give some opinions here, maybe you don't have an opinion, that's totally fine too, but trying to get a gauge here. And then we'll do pro for the node pool by force, and then against. I still think that just doesn't look right to me, but we'll go with it. Okay, perfect. Perfect, Ted. I'm glad that you have that opinion. Feel free to like against. That's what I'm trying to gauge here. And then if you have a strong opinion on these things, please email me directly, and I'll make sure that I pass that along. Any questions around these things? Does it make sense? Cool. Okay. Some people, we have a lot of opinionated people about this, that's totally fine. But if you do end up having an opinion, or for whatever reason, if you can't access the chat, or you have like thoughts on both of them and just want to send them directly, then you can do that. We appreciate the insights. Okay, cool. Michael, anything else you want to add, or anyone else on the call, anything that you want to share before we close out? Okay, great. Well, I hope this was valuable, useful, hopefully. Michael, did you have something you wanted to add?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay.
Thanks for the time, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much. All right, we will see y'all again next time. We'll get a topic up there soon. Hopefully, we're going to have within the next couple of sessions someone from the Azure Security Center for AKS team on to talk through some of the updates and the latest and greatest that they've been working on, especially when it comes to things like Azure Defender. So yeah, we appreciate your participation. And once again, look forward to hearing from some of y'all. And if I had an action item to connect you with Michael, then I will do that today. So I will see y'all next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.